Hi everyone, just before we get this next history hack outing going, just a reminder to say that we are on Patreon. If you head to patreon.com/history hack, you can see all the amazing tiers that start from just £3 a month. But we know that supporting a pod that you might not listen to all of the episodes on, for shame, you may want to just tip us for an episode. So we have signed up with Ko-Fi. So if you go to ko-fi.com/history hack, you can tip us for an episode that you've listened to and quite liked. So whichever way you're able to support us, whether that's just sharing the pod with your friends or being able to support us financially, we cannot thank you enough. So without further ado, hello and welcome to History Hack. We have a fantastic guest and I have an incredible co-host with me today, but it's going to take some work to convince me today because we have the lovely Charlotte White with us. And who shall we be chatting to today, Charlie?
Look, we're going to sell you on this, Boney. Come on. It's going to be, you're going to love this. You're going to love this episode. Yes, you are. We have got Dr. Owen Emmerson with us today, and he's the castle historian and assistant curator at Hever Castle. For those who don't immediately recognize the name, that's Anne Boleyn's family home. You may have seen him sharing his insights into the Boleyn family in the BBC's recent The Boleyns, a Scandalous Family. And we're delighted to have him here with us today to set the record straight on the portrayals of Anne Boleyn that really grind his gears. Hello, Owen.
Hello, it's an absolute pleasure to be joining you today.
We think here at History Hack that we provide a safe space for experts to rant expertly.
Fantastic. I need that space, unfortunately.
And you must get this a lot. I mean, working with a legend such as the legend around Anne Boleyn and working in her family home, there must be a few things about the way you see her portrayed that irritate you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm quite odd in the fact that I quite enjoy most portrayals of Anne Boleyn. I'm a social and cultural historian, so I really like unpicking why it is that Anne has been portrayed across the centuries in certain ways. So, but yes, there are varied interpretations, shall we say, of Anne Boleyn on screen in particular. And a lot of people were drawn to her childhood home because of these portrayals. So, you know, you do have to be geared up to receive a public who have very divergent ideas about who she was.
I am one of those divergent publics. So, let's get the ball rolling. And possibly counterintuitively, we're going to start this in the Victorian age. So, Owen, what did the Victorians make of Anne Boleyn, and how did that shape the representations of her that we sort of still see today?
That's a really important question, I think, because the Victorians had a very specific idea of who Anne Boleyn was, and I find it quite a flat one. She's either sort of a hapless victim or an evil temptress, and these are sort of themes that will continue to permeate popular culture across the 20th century. There's all very little shade to her character, and I think actually Queen Victoria played a role in engendering particularly this idea of her being a hapless victim. She actually visited Hever Castle in 1834, and she calls her in her diary poor Queen Anne Boleyn in her diaries. So I think that she was almost a catalyst for this enduring fascination with Anne throughout the Victorian era. She purchases items relating to Anne for the royal collection.
Ooh, and what did she get?
So she purchases the wedding clock that Henry VIII purchased or had created for Anne for their wedding from the Walpole collection. She puts that into the royal collection. And she also sketches Anne Boleyn on a number of occasions. She goes to the opera to see the opera of Anna Bolena. And so, yeah, there's these beautiful sketches of Anne Boleyn in popular culture, as it were. But she also sort of reshapes locations relating to Anne Boleyn, such as the Tower of London. They are reshaped into the image of Anne's Tower that the Victorians had. So for the first time, for example, her grave is marked out during Victoria's reign. And also the scaffold site is erroneously marked out. This is the site where Anne Boleyn was executed. So you can see them sort of shaping the tower into their own idea of what happened there.
Just on that, so is where the little glass pillow is that correct, or is that Victorian?
It's Victorian, I'm afraid. So yes, there was a visit to the tower, and Prince Albert asked that the scaffold site be marked out because he believed that Victoria would appreciate it. And they were basically armed with a contemporary sketch of a firing squad where people were executed on that spot. So it was assumed that was the place of execution. We actually know that Anne was executed a few hundred yards away from there, actually opposite where the entrance to the Crown Jewels is today, on the parade ground.
Wow.
So yes, and we know that, for example, Lady Jane Grey was executed on the other side of the White Tower. So yes, there wasn't sort of a permanent place where these things happened. They happened years apart, and scaffolds would be erected in differing parts of the tower precinct. So yes, it was sort of simplified, shall we say, into this narrative that yeoman warders could give tours around. So yes, this is very much a Victorian image of what happened, and I think this does begin to permeate into popular culture. Our earliest surviving film of Anne Boleyn comes in the 1920s, and it's really a morality tale for young girls. Yes, so this is a melodrama. This is Anne who's in love with someone else and is chased by a vicious king, a monster, and pays the ultimate price. A very, very flat image of this fascinating woman, if you ask me. And that really sort of continues into the 1950s. It has really, really long legs.
Gosh. That's incredible. So in effect, the Victorians' invention of tourism, as we know it today, going to see stately homes and castles, has affected the story of Anne Boleyn. Come and see where this sad woman lost her head.
Absolutely, and also, working in a place like Hever Castle, which, although it's the same space that Anne occupied, has been reimagined over the generations, not least by William Wardorf Astor in the Edwardian era. We get a sense of this aesthetic of what the Tudor court would have been like, this oaken panelled, dark chambered environment, which really isn't the case. I mean, most Tudor rooms would have been plasterwalled, hung with beautiful arras and bright tapestries, which would have caught the light, and this would have been a really bright environment, because of course they didn't have electric lighting. They needed chambers to be brighter. So yeah, I think we can sense like popular culture drawing upon these pastiches and creating a Tudor aesthetic that never really existed. And the same is happening for the stories of the people that occupied these spaces. So yes. So if you look at, for example, The Private Life of Henry VIII, a film in the 30s, again, we see Anne.
I love that film.
Oh, it's amazing. It's a comedy. I mean, it's a brilliant film, largely and unusually centered around husband and wife, Charles Lawton and Elsa Lancaster, and the Anne of Cleves story. That's the sort of thrust of the film. But again, Anne's brief appearance is this victim. It's a beautiful portrayal by Mel Oberon, but it's not a rounded figure, shall we say. I mean, she's literally on the way to the block as the film starts. So yes, a very flat Anne Boleyn to begin the 20th century.
But she does start to push back. You can't keep a good woman down. She starts to push back in the 1960s. So tell us what you make of Anne of 1,000 Days, because this is perhaps the first screen representation of Anne Boleyn that is still widely watched today. I believe it's available on Netflix and or Amazon Prime if anyone hasn't seen it. Are we any closer at this point to finding the real Anne Boleyn in the swinging 60s?
I love this portrayal. I think it's a landmark performance, actually, by Geneviève Bujold. It brings blood and fire back into the character. And it is a huge departure from this victim narrative. It feels very 1960s, but it's actually based on an earlier play from 1948 by Maxwell Anderson. They originally starred Rex Harrison and Joyce Redman. Now, there was a television version of the play in the early 50s, which was rebranded as the Trial of Amberlynn. They weren't able to insert all of the content because of the Hays Code, which prevented immoral subjects being discussed on film, such as incest, which necessarily needs to be part of the plot. So it wasn't until the late 60s, when the Hays Code had been lifted, that this film could be brought to life. And significant changes happened in between 1948 and 1969, not least because the screenplay was written by Bridgette Bowland. And she makes the film all about Anne Boleyn. This is not a film about Henry VIII at all. And whereas in the play, it's Henry VIII who gets the last line, in the film, it's Anne. And it's such a brilliant and defiant ending. We get this completely fictitious tower scene where Anne completely shreds Richard Burton's Henry VIII. Prophesying that his son will be overshadowed by the Boleyn heir, Elizabeth I. It's a really, really glorious scene that allows us to believe that Anne went down fighting, and with a confident belief that her daughter will succeed to the throne, that her blood will be well spent. It's a glorious scene, and Geneviève Bujold, our Canadian Anne Boleyn, is magnificent in it. I mean, she really should have got an Oscar for that scene alone. I think it's just magnificent. But yeah, I mean, we're really reshaping Anne Boleyn here. This is an Anne who is defying her family. She's defying the king. She's refusing to be his mistress. And she's asking for power in return for acquiescing to his advances. And she can be seen to be exercising that power on screen as well. So this really is a radical departure from the more traditional narratives that we'd seen up until this point. And I would argue every performance of Anne Boleyn since has its roots in Bujold's performance. It's quite magnificent.
And of course, she's opposite Richard Burton, my favourite.
I've just looked it up. She got nominated and lost out to Maggie Smith.
He did, yeah, for the Prime of Miss Jean Brodie. I mean, Richard Burton really hated his performance in the film, and I think he's really quite brilliant in it. But she does act him under the table, and there's a really weird dynamic going on set as well, because Elizabeth Taylor wanted to play the role of Anne, but was deemed too old to do it. And there's sort of a mirroring going on here between the story of Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn and the story of Elizabeth Taylor and Geneviève Bujold, because Elizabeth Taylor was terrified that Richard Burton was going to fall in love with Geneviève Bujold as Anne Boleyn. And there are more than hints that something is going on in Richard Burton's diaries, that he is slightly obsessed with Geneviève Bujold, almost hate obsessed with her. He calls her Gin in his diaries. And we also know that Elizabeth Taylor read Richard Burton's diaries. So a lot of the slightly ungenerous stuff that he's writing about her may seem slightly placed, shall we say. Yeah. And there is a really nice anecdote that Elizabeth Taylor is on set so much to try and thwart any relationship that she's actually given a bit part. She does appear in the film as an uncredited cameo part. And Bujol was so furious that Taylor is on set all of the time that she sort of loses it just before doing that magnificent tower scene. And she says to the director, I'm going to give that bitch an acting lesson she will never forget. So this is really weird sort of subtext going on in the background that is mirroring what's happening on screen. It's quite extraordinary, really.
How fantastic. Any stories about Burton and Taylor I'm here for.
Oh my God, yeah. No, totally. And not least, he buys her the La Peregrina pearl just before this film starts shooting. And it's widely believed he purchases this as a sorry you didn't get to play Anne moment, which is, and this pearl, of course, was owned by Mary I. You know, this is a really historic pearl. And Elizabeth Taylor actually wears it to Hever Castle. It's a lovely little tie in with the Tudor story. It's quite amazing.
Goodness.
We should move on, otherwise we will sit here and talk about Burton and Taylor far too much. So let's move things forward a little bit. So this push to make Anne sort of protagonist in her own right, so takes a step further in the other Boleyn girl, where we go from the powerful woman making the pronouncement just before she dies to a bit of a bitch, basically. So have we gone too far the other way, or is that a little bit closer to the real Anne?
I think in a way we're getting a little bit closer, but in another way we're simply pivoting to another perspective and seeing every bit as narrow a view as we have before, and perhaps even more so. I mean, the Anne of history, let's be honest, was far from being universally liked or approved of by her contemporaries. She really divided opinion like no other person. But even her adversaries were obsessed by her. They couldn't help but note down what she was wearing, what she was saying, what she was doing. I mean, she beguiled everyone, whether or not they liked or loathed her. And I think, you know, what we do know from many, many sources is that she had wit, intelligence. She could command the attention of a room with ease. And I don't actually think we see anything like that in the other Boleyn girl. This is quite, again, another flat interpretation. And I also, and I'm saying this as a man sitting here from the comfort of my desk, I find it a really odd idea that it's a sort of a feminist act to rehabilitate one woman's character at the expense of bringing another woman's character down. This was very much billed as a feminist text because it rehabilitated Mary Boleyn. But in doing so, there's sort of a pendulum shift, in my opinion, that all of the historic tropes about Anne Boleyn are reattached to her. And we really see a monster Anne in this portrayal. We see her plotting to kill Catherine of Aragon and Catherine's daughter Mary. She actually does kill Bishop Fisher in this novel. It's quite an extraordinary claim. She does sleep with her brother. She does the very thing that is she's accused of at her trial. And in a way, we're reattaching all of the Catholic propaganda that was placed on Anne Boleyn during Elizabeth I's reign. All of these tropes are being resurrected and reattached to her. But of course, we do have a very interesting perspective of Mary Boleyn here, a very saintly portrayal of Mary. And I'm not really sure where any of that comes from, to be honest, because we know so very little about Mary Boleyn. Eric Ives, the late great professor who sort of wrote the canonical text on Anne Boleyn, once quipped that everything we know about Mary Boleyn could fit on a postcard with room to spare for the address. And we really just have one letter from Mary Boleyn. It's a letter to Cromwell after she's banished. from court for marrying without familial and royal consent. And my God, she is such a Boleyn in this letter. It's headstrong and obstinate, and she's essentially saying, I'd rather beg my bread and love than be any queen like my sister. So we see this monstering of Anne to create a saintly Mary Boleyn, and I think neither characterization is compelling or accurate. Again, we've made both women really rather boring and quite flat.
I mean, we should say that we're discussing here the novel, The Other Boleyn Girl. We're not even going to mention the Hollywood turd fest that came out of it, where there was all the way through. I was thinking Cardinal Wolsey's going to come in at any minute. Any minute. Here comes Cardinal Wolsey, and they completely left him out. Now, I feel I have to jump in just as the woman in the room about the feminist portrayal in this. It's so interesting what you say, because they've taken Mary and they've made her the Victorian Anne. She's completely helpless. All these things happen to her. Like everything happens to Mary Boleyn. She has no agency whatsoever. And with Anne, I find the most interesting thing about that novel is the question. And with any feminist portrayal of women, the rehabilitation can never be to try and make them perfect, because guess what? We're not. We're just humans. And with Anne and the incest question, even though that was 100, I believe it was completely fabricated to bring her down. But there's an interesting question in that. If you are in Anne's position and you put yourself in her shoes, and he needs a son, and we don't know whether he's able to provide her with one, because no one discusses what, Henry's ability in the bedroom. Who can you trust? And who, if that child came out looking like Henry Norris, it's like that. The prince looks a bit Norrisy. He looks a bit like Western. He just looked like a Boleyn. You say he looks like a Boleyn. So, I liked that the book raised that question, because it was never explicit. It was the door is shut, literally. You don't know what's happening behind that door. But she might have been cleverer. And I think that's where the Other Boleyn Girl gives Anne a little bit more, is they suggest she might have been really, really quite clever.
That's a really, really good point, actually. And I think it does give her a sense of intelligence that other portrayals just hadn't really touched upon. Even with Bujold's portrayal in Anne of the Thousand Days, we get a sense that all of these things are happening to her, and she's making the best deal that she can out of all the things that are being foisted upon her. Whereas you're right, in The Other Boleyn Girl, we do see a lot more agency, even if it's not the kind of decision making that I think necessarily actually happened. So in that sense, you're completely right. There is a lot more intelligence on the show, isn't there?
But of course, we don't particularly like intelligent women. Clearly, she's a bitch. But
sadly so.
I know, isn't it? Nothing changes. Let's jump forward. Let's have a little bit of fun here. Let's go into some really fun portrayals. And I think we can all agree that The Tudors was some quality historical TV softcore. That's what it was. So tell us about Natalie Dormer's portrayal of Anne. Is it true that she actually got a bit involved in that?
Yeah. Oh,
she's so beautiful.
She is, and so it's such an electric performance, isn't it? It very much reminds me of Bujold's Anne. It's all Bujold for a new generation, and there are massive differences between the portrayals as well. And my goodness, it really, really was a softcore production, wasn't it? I mean, everything's going on in this one. And, I love it for all its madness. I really do. And it kind of irks me that, a lot of eminent historians have really enjoyed dunking, on this particular series. But my goodness, how many how many people have been drawn into these many people's stories because of this one very, very elaborate television series, and that can only be a good thing. My goodness, it really can. But I think it's a wonderfully mad portrayal, and yet there are flickers of brilliance in this series. There really are, and I think Dormer was instrumental in ensuring that Anne Boleyn shone in the same kind of way that Bridgette had. And this is definitely an Anne for the noughties. But I get the feeling that this Anne Boleyn would have been far naughtier had it not been for Natalie Dormer insisting that it was taken a bit more seriously, that Anne was taken a bit more seriously, and that primary sources were consulted, and that this was reflected in her character in the second series. And you can see a real discernible difference between the Anne Boleyn of the first series and the Anne Boleyn of the second series. She herself really did her homework and wanted just a fairer portrayal, a fairer sort of slice of the pie for Anne. And I think we get a much keener sense of power play in the second series. We see Anne's agency a lot more. We sort of get a bit further away from this idea that she's being completely manipulated either by the king or the male relatives in her household. And we see her again wielding considerable power. We see lovely vignettes, for example, of her religious beliefs, which are sort of threaded throughout this sort of crazy narrative that's constructed. And just little things like she insisted that Anne's hair be dark. They really wanted to have a blonde Anne Boleyn for some reason, but she just went ahead and dyed her hair because she understood the importance of Anne looking different, because she did look different. You know, she did sort of cut against the grain of what was desirable in the Tudor era. So yeah, I've got huge respect for her. Actually, I think she did some really good and interesting things for that series.
Has she ever been to Hever?
That's a really good question. I know she did some sort of promotional videos at the Tower of London and Hampton Court, but I never saw one at Hever Castle. And in fact, in the Tudors, the series, Hever is it does appear, but very CGI'd. So I think most of the filming was done in Ireland, actually. So yeah, we didn't actually get to appear in the Tudors physically, which is a shame.
Oh.
Yeah, very much so. I actually really loved many elements of Helena Bonham Carter's portrayal of Anne Boleyn. Again, this is a really bonkers series. I mean, it's from 2003. It's sort of ITV's sort of power play, I guess, to show the BBC that they could be a major player in the historical drama arena, and they haven't really done the Tudors before. This was a new thing. When in the 1970s, the BBC were sort of dominating with the Tudor trilogy of The Six Wives of Henry VIII, Elizabeth R, and The Shadow of the Tower series. ITV were kind of doing Edwardian stuff and Austen stuff, and I think this was their sort of first real sort of foray into Tudor drama. And it is slightly bonkers. I actually think Ray Winstone has moments of genius in it. He does look very like Henry VIII.
Which series is this? I don't think I've seen this.
Yeah, so this is from 2003. It's a two-parter. and he plays Henry VIII. He has a wonderful Cockney accent in it, of course. And, you know, there are moments where he's sort of shouting Anne in a really amazing and very entertaining way. But yeah, I mean, again, I think actually Peter Morgan drew upon all the worst sort of tropes of the Six Wives. I mean, Catherine of Aragon is just a bit part again. Poor Catherine of Aragon. I wish we could have a renaissance of, like, you know, her being taken seriously. I guess we've seen that, the beginnings of that, in the Spanish Princess series, but she's always second fiddle, isn't she? And it's so frustrating. It really is, because as someone who adores Anne Boleyn, I see many of the same qualities in Catherine of Aragon that I do in Anne, and it really irks me that she's this sort of just throwaway bit part. It's really frustrating.
Let's turn this particular screw a little bit more and bring in Mr.
I
Peter
love
Morgan,
her
who seems
so
to be
much.
Mr. Royal.
She's so brilliant
these
and
days.
sharp. And I just
so everybody
wish
knows
they
the
would
Crown,
start
and they
like
probably
Catherine of
heard
Aragon's story
weird
before
debates
she
going on
has to
about
be
them
pious
at
and
the moment
sad,
about putting
because this was a really powerful and brilliant woman who deserves better than just
but he
being
did give us Ray Winston
sort of the foreground of Anne Boleyn's story.
He should be knighted for.
She was married to Henry for longer than all the other wives put together.
What about that portrayal?
You know, she has moments
sort of early
of
90s.
utter brilliance, and I'd love to have seen a whole episode of a Sumter playing her, because she did a brilliant job. She really, really did. But of course, this wasn't Peter Morgan's only foray into the Tudor world. He did the film version of The Other Boleyn Girl, and actually he sort of self-plagiarized a bit in that film. He brought a lot of the scenes that he created for Henry VIII into the Philippa Gregory adaptation. And one of them, and I'm going to put a content warning here about sexual assault and rape, because in both productions we have Henry VIII raping Anne, and I've never really been able to get my head around why this was firstly done in the first instance in 2003, because there was a big discussion about it then. And Peter Morgan responded by saying, and I quote, "Most historians will find what we have done scandalous, but I'm aiming to stimulate greater interest in history rather than to score points with a particular version of events." And I can't really relate to that inclusion, sort of stimulating any kind of meaningful discussion. It's not rooted in the historical narrative in any way at all. And even Helen Bonham Carter talked at the time about how disturbing she found it to do, and then it was repeated in the film version of The Other Boleyn Girl, and I could not get my head around why it was there. And I think that we do need to have an important discussion about the use of such a plot line. What is it there for? Is it literally just there to titillate, which is what that kind of suggests? And I find that really disturbing, actually.
It's almost like, when it says it's there to provoke discussion, it's there to provoke discussion of, look what we've done, isn't this scandalous and naughty? It didn't even fit with the narrative of the film. It didn't feel like, because you feel like maybe, okay, even if you're going to give him completely free reign, if artistically it had felt like that portrayal was leading up to that inevitable conclusion, and it felt right.
Joined us a few times on the pod.
Slide a little bit. It was so tagged on, like you say, just there to titillate, or not good.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think what was worse actually was the implication that Anne had almost driven him to it.
Yeah.
That she'd used her French ways to beguile him in the first place, and that this was that sort of the natural conclusion of what she'd been doing. And in both instances, in the 2003 version, it happens during Anne's queenship, and is sort of the marker of where things go wrong.
Yeah.
But later in the other Boleyn girl film, it happens just before they marry, and Anne and Henry are never happy during their marriage in that film. I mean, it's such a brief queenship, and I just take real objection to them using this horrific act of violence as the sort of turning point of that leads to Anne's downfall. It feels utterly repugnant to me, if I'm honest. And yeah.
And in terms of a portrayal of a woman that you've spent a lot of time with, to effectively say she was asking for it and that's what she got is hugely offensive.
It really, really is. And I do come across this sentiment much more often than I would like to, if I'm honest. If I do upload a video to YouTube, quite often, I would say about 5% of the responses to it are, she deserved what she got. And I can't help but think these really ugly, these really mean girlish portrayals have sort of underpinned that narrative of she got what she deserved, essentially. And that really doesn't sit well with me, regardless of what you think about her. The notion that she deserved that horrific act of violence at the end of her life is
we should say that we've moved on now to talking about deserving having her head cut off.
Head cut off, absolutely.
Just as evil a sentiment.
Yes.
It's a shame that by giving her agency, it's meant that, well, it's your fault then.
Yes.
You can either be a victim or it's your fault.
And this is the ultimate horrific dichotomy, isn't it? It's like careful what you wish for, isn't it? If you want to see a woman enacting agency, then you're going to see a very horrific and ugly version of her doing so. It's like you can't win, really.
Yeah, those morality tales of the Hays Code haven't gone too far. But let's bring us bang up to date. And this is where I get my fangirl on, because if there's one thing I want to be when I grow up, it's Hilary Mantel, because I love her more than I can tell you. So let's talk about the most recent portrayal of Anne in popular fiction. Talk to us about Wolf Hall. Is this the most honest Anne?
This is a really contentious issue, actually, among the Anne fandom, because there is a massive fandom of Anne Boleyn. And actually, Claire Foy's portrayal of Anne wasn't particularly well received amongst the fandom, and nor, of course, were the novels that came before. But I have a real liking of it, actually, and I think the question of it being the most honest portrayal is a really important one, because while it may not be the most rounded performance or sort of characterization, Hilary Mantel was really sort of explicit about the fact that there's always a piece of Anne Boleyn's puzzle missing. And I think any historian worth a grain of salt would recognise the fact that we actually don't have a full Anne Boleyn in the historical records. We are pretty much always seeing her through other people's eyes, for a start. We do luckily have a few surviving letters and a few inscriptions in Anne's own words, but the rest of the story is being told by other people. And this is, I think, probably the most honest way of portraying Anne. And of course, we are always seeing Anne Boleyn in Wolf Hall and Bring Up the Bodies through the eyes of Thomas Cromwell. And to me, this is honest, because we only really see her through other people's eyes, as I've said, through the eyes of Eustache Chapuis, for example, the Spanish ambassador. We get a lot of our information about what Anne says, does, through his reports. And do you know what? To Cromwell, Anne probably wouldn't have been the most appealing person to look at. We know that she is very class conscious. We know towards the end of her queenship, she admonishes Mark Smeaton for looking at her because he's an inferior person. This is someone who would have looked very different to different people at court. And I do find some real honesty here, actually. She wasn't a liked individual. Even members of her own family struggled to support her queenship. And she did make herself very unpopular. And Claire Foy does a really, really brilliant job in this role of showing a woman who is committed to her beliefs, who is exercising power, but who is vulnerable. And I think we can see a lot of her hardness as vulnerability, because she is alone. She only has the support of a few members of her family and the king. And I love how bold Claire Foy is in this part. I think she really gets to the nub of what made Anne so fascinating. And more than that, she takes us on a journey which I think is massively impressive. I think it'd be hard, to warm to Anne Boleyn at the beginning of the series, but it would be hard not to have a broken heart for her at the end when she's on the scaffold, completely vulnerable, and is showing amazing bravery, but is obviously terrified, which anyone would be in that situation. And I think that's an amazing arc to go on. I mean, when Geneviève Bujold stands on the scaffold, your heart has been with her right from the beginning. You've always been on her side, but not with Claire Foy. And yet she manages even to bring, on side those who weren't supporting her. And that is what the Anne of history did. So when Anne is tried, people like Eustace Chapuis, who have no love for her, because he is the Spanish ambassador, he's naturally going to be supportive of Catherine of Aragon. Even he knows that she's innocent. Even he begins to start feeling sympathy toward her and knows that she's being stitched up and can't really believe that the king is going to do what he's going to do to her. You can actually see him changing his mind. And there's also a poem by Lancelot de Carle, who was working for the French ambassador. He writes this amazing poem after Anne's downfall, where he shows why people would believe her to be guilty. Of course, Mark Smeaton, the court musician, confessed to having committed adultery with Anne, probably under torture. But he demonstrates that even up until Anne is tried, people are thinking that she's guilty, but her performance, both at her trial and her execution, convinces people otherwise. You can see that she has made people's opinion shift. So brilliant is she at defending herself. So I think we really are seeing here a reflection of what actually happened at the time. And from a historian's perspective, that's a magical thing.
The thing with Claire Foy and that performance that really got me, and it's straight out of the pages of the book, is Anne on the scaffold, still looking round, still waiting for Henry to come and call it off and, say, right, you've learnt your lesson, go off and live in a nunnery, or haha, it was all a joke, because we know he liked to sort of masquerade and that kind of thing. And she does that perfectly throughout the whole thing. I mean, calling Cromwell Crimwell the whole way to his affected French accent is just beautiful, because you just think she's such a cow. She's wonderful. But that moment where, and you get the sense that maybe nobody believed that was genuinely going to happen, and except Cromwell, or maybe he didn't even. Yeah, it's the shock.
That it really is a shocking scene, and it was so beautifully directed, so beautifully played by Claire Foy. And you're completely right. Henry was so involved in what was going to happen to Anne, and Tracy Borman has uncovered this recently. He was involved in the real minutiae of what was going to happen to his wife on that scaffold. It's really chilling. There is documentation that he's setting down precedents, not only of what's to happen to Anne, but any future queens. It's a really chilling moment that you're getting into Henry's psychology. But there are mistakes on that day which tell us that I think people did not believe it was going to happen. For example, Henry had ordered that no foreigners were to view the execution of the Queen, and yet they left the gates open, which meant that a huge number of people did witness it. Perhaps 2,000 people witnessed this so-called private execution. There was also the question of the coffin. No one thought to create a coffin for the Queen's body. I think this tells us that it was expected, at least by some people involved in the preparations, that this wasn't actually going to go ahead. And Anne's body lies there on the scaffold while they're trying to think of what they can do with it. They have to go to the armory and find a chest that was designed to carry bow staves. And she's buried in an elm arrow chest. These are not the actions of people who are well prepared for what is going to happen. That might be reflective of the brevity of Anne's downfall, because it was alarmingly brief. No other person in Tudor history fell as quickly as Anne Boleyn.
Well, Cromwell did a bit.
Yes, yeah, but even he managed to stay in the Tower longer than the Queen. I mean, it's extraordinary. I think between arrest and execution, it's about 50 odd days, if I've got it correct, with Cromwell. With Catherine Howard, she's languishing in Sion House for months. Because the king actually wants to get to the bottom of what has happened. He doesn't need to do that with Anne Boleyn because nothing had happened. It was a stitch-up job. Anne is dead within 2 weeks. It's extraordinary. I mean, even Moore and Fisher languish in the Tower for a year. It's it reeks of a stitch-up job. And you are so right that Claire's performance in that sort of really highlights how uncertain everyone was. This wasn't, I think we all often read history backwards and see these things as an inevitability, but a Queen of England had never been put to death before. This was an unthinkable act. And until that sword swung, I think most people would have thought, that's not going to happen.
I just wanted to say Peter Kaminsky directs that scene perfectly. Just the way he makes her so alone.
Yes.
And the way she can't say her last words, and this unrealness of everything. It's, as someone who's not a big fan of the Boleyns, you kind of think, oh, here we go. But even my hard, cold heart absolutely broke for her in that scene. I thought Claire Foy was incredible, and that little bit of distance between the audience and the swordsman preparing it's and it just seems to go on forever.
Yeah, as these things would have. They were ceremonial. There was etiquette to it. You had to say certain things in your execution speech, and there was a protocol to go through, and it was a real mark of genius on Peter Kuzminski's part to intercut it with a previous conversation that Cromwell had with the executioner, explaining what was going to happen. It really prolonged that horror in a way that was really quite effective. And I think it's the only iteration of Anne's execution on screen that didn't glorify it in some weird way. Because of course that ceremonial element to an execution was meant to glorify it in a certain way, that the etiquette made it almost like a state occasion. This didn't feel like that at all. It just felt you were almost a voyeur on something really horrific, which of course it was.
Yeah, she's very much a victim and not a martyr.
Well,
yes.
She's a human. I think that's where the real rehabilitation comes in Claire Foy's performance, and obviously the great Dame Hilary Mantel's writing, is that you don't like Anne every day, you don't like her the whole way through, but you feel very, very bad when she has her head cut off for something she didn't do. That it's, just, you don't have to think that she was a saint to not want to see somebody end in that way.
That's such a beautiful way of putting it. It really is.
Yeah. But we haven't talked about all of the portrayals of Anne Boleyn and you know perhaps the greatest Henry VIII film, Carry On, Henry.
Oh God, yeah, absolutely. good old Carry On, Henry. You can't but not love it. don't. It's so, honestly, I think it's one of the most beautiful sort of takes on. I think that they had to change the subtitle of it because it was meant to be Anne of the Thousand Lays. And apparently, Universal weren't very happy about it because they'd been very generous in loaning loads of the sets and costumes from Anne of the Thousand Days for the piss take version, basically. I love those carry-ons. They're amazing. The fact that they did the same for Cleopatra as well, Carry On Cleo. They used all the costumes, all the sets. It's amazing. Such a stroke of genius to, do it on a shoestring budget, but make it look as beautiful as the thing you're taking the piss out of. It's amazing.
I think that's a great place because I'm going to start talking about Carry On Cleo now. But so that is probably a good point to start wrapping up. Owen, you have made me think about the way I've looked at the Boleyns and Anne particularly. So thank you very much for that. Still not their biggest fans as a family. I think they had issues, to put it mildly. But this has been fantastic fun. Thank you so much for putting me right. And I do need to go back and watch Anne of a Thousand Days because that is a marvelous film. But thank you so much, Charlie. As always, an utter pleasure.
Fabulous.
And History Hack fans, we shall be back. Thank you as always.